So I would like to welcome you all to today's session on policy framework, developing and reviewing policies and our process. My name is Bridget Booty. I am the Senior Director for Policy and Records Management at the Middle States Commission on Higher Education, and I will be walking you through some of our learning objectives for today. So the first is understanding principles for sound policy development. This framework is used by the Commission, and the exact processes that are outlined in this presentation may be adjusted to meet your organization's own needs and goals. We will go over the principles for sound quality policy development, and by the end of this training, you should understand these principles for policy development, including the role and importance of the policy review process, and understand how you might see opportunity for policy development focus areas. You can see here today on today's agenda that aligns with our learning objectives from the previous slide. So to start, I did want to just kind of state the obvious and give the big question for why we're here and understanding why a policy framework is important. It's critical to ensuring clear and consistent processes and expectations for institutions and organizational administration. A policy framework ensures that the organization develops and adheres to the policy it develops in a manner that is fair, consistent, and impartial. So in this presentation, we kind of have a mix of some of the principles of policy development as well as Middle States Commission on Higher Education's own approach to policy framework and development. So at MSCHE, our policy framework begins with our standards, as well as applicable federal regulatory requirements, and a document called the Evidence Expectations by Standard Guidelines. This document outlines all of the specific types of evidence the Commission will consider when evaluating whether or not an institution meets its standards. The Commission's policy and procedures are informed by these three other areas and forms the linchpin of our policy framework. So you can see here that we kind of have a little house built, and when you're thinking about building policy and procedures, consider the framework upon which policies will be developed from. Here I visualize these principles or aspects that go into building a strong policy framework. So you can see, as I mentioned earlier, we have our standards for accreditation and requirements of affiliation. That's a foundational element. We also have our evidence expectations by standard guidelines, which outline how institutions will document and demonstrate their compliance with the standards. We also have best practices for how institutions of higher education should conduct themselves and operate. And we also have applicable federal regulatory requirements. These are the foundation upon which other aspects of the policy process rest upon in order to build a sound policy framework and policies in general. So the next few slides will talk a little bit more in depth about these most critical pieces of the Commission's policy framework. The Commission maintains its standards for accreditation and requirements of affiliation on its website, much like your organization has done. A supplemental document called the Evidence Expectations by Standard Guidelines expounds upon these standards. As I mentioned before, the evidence expectations detail all of the methods that an institution may document compliance with a particular standard. When building out standards and policies, consider what compliance might look like and how institutions can document and demonstrate their compliance with your standards. Here you will see our standards for accreditation. I will not expand on these much as they're being addressed in another session, but I do just include them as here they are, FYI. Similar to the previous slide, here you will see MSCHE's requirements of affiliation. These are the 4 baseline objectives that an institution must meet in order to even be eligible for accreditation. MSCHE used to maintain 14 requirements of affiliation, and as you saw in the previous slide, in the last revision process, those 14 requirements were distilled into 4 requirements of affiliation, and the remaining former requirements of affiliation were folded into our existing standards. I provide these to you as context for the Commission's policy framework. I have mentioned the Commission's Evidence Expectations by Standard Guidelines document. This document is critical for institutions seeking to understand how to demonstrate compliance with policy and procedures. It ensures that institutions have a clear roadmap of what they can submit to document compliance, and it ensures that MSCHE has a clear and impartial document against which to evaluate institutions. Consider if this kind of document, one that outlines what compliance looks like for each standard that you've developed, is a crucial part of your policy framework. MSCHE institutions are responsible for meeting Commission policy and procedures. The Commission's policy framework supplements and supports the accreditation standards and the requirements of affiliation. All MSCHE policies, procedures, and guidelines that are currently in effect are posted on the Browse Policy and Procedures page and listed in alphabetical order. We do revise our policies periodically, and the policies that are in the process of being updated and approved but are not yet in effect are posted on the Policies Under Review page on the MSCHE website. I will talk a little bit more about the policy development process a little later on. For now, consider how you might display and disseminate your organization's policy to your membership and other stakeholders. Because MSCHE is recognized by the U.S. Department of Education as an institutional accreditor, we must meet certain criteria established by the department. These requirements are listed on this slide. In exchange for recognition by the department, institutionals play a vital role in allowing institutions to access federal student financial aid or Title IV funding. These federal requirements also inform some policy processes that we are required to have by regulation. I will talk more about our required public comment process mandated by these regulations later in the presentation. The Commission often considers its existing policies and procedures for changes and also identifies when new policies and procedures may be needed. This is done through a regular cycle of review. This allows us to be sure that policy captures emerging issues and addresses changes in the higher education environment, including regulatory changes. These may be appropriate influences upon the Commission's policy and procedures. Policies, procedures, and guidelines also may be updated to reflect any changes resulting from a major revision of the accreditation standards or accreditation processes. Policies are built upon foundational principles rooted in considerations of the current policy and regulatory environment, current practices in accreditation and higher education, good communication between the accreditor and staff, commissioners, institutions, and other stakeholders, and upholding consistency, fairness, and equity across all developed policy. To support our work in this area, we established a framework that includes a policy document, a related set of procedures, and any additional necessary guidance. We continue to use this framework as we develop new policy at MSCHE. In determining our policy priorities, consider setting policy priorities annually to ensure the consistent review. You may want to consider setting aside time prior to the start of the year where you will discuss with stakeholders what policies need to be developed or updated based on need, regulatory changes, or changes in best practices for higher education. Stakeholders play an essential role in this process. You can involve these stakeholders and consider what areas frequently raise questions by your membership or other stakeholders in order to determine what policies may be revised or need to be developed. At MSCHE, our established policy framework is comprised of policies, procedures, guidelines, and forms, and it is designed to address external mandates such as federal regulations and help govern the actions of the Commission, staff, peer evaluators, member institutions, and anything that falls within the scope of the institution's activities, including related entities. All policies that are developed are accompanied by a set of procedures, and they both carry equal weight in governing the action of the Commission, the Commission's representatives, and member institutions. Policies establish fundamental principles to mandate action or govern the action of the Commission. The Commission has two types of policies, and we will expand more on those in just a moment. Our procedures define a series of steps, methods, or course of action taken to implement the policies. So the policies are what we say must happen, and the procedures are how that will happen. Guidelines are based on effective practices and may provide advice to member institutions and peer evaluators for implementing the accreditation standards, policies, or procedures. Finally, forms are pre-formatted documents designed to facilitate the submission of consistent information to the Commission or for use by member institutions or peer evaluators for accreditation activities. This may include forms for submission of reports or requests for substantive change. In developing your own policy framework, consider what types of policy documents must be developed in order to ensure consistency, fairness, and equity. As I mentioned before, the Commission maintains different types of policies that have specific development and approval processes. The first policy type is accreditation policies, and within accreditation policies, we have several different subtypes. One of these subtypes of an accreditation policy is accreditation activities, reviews, or proceedings. You can see MSCHE policies that fall under this category on this slide. Notice that these kinds of policies are focused on the accreditation process, what actions the Commission will take towards an institution, how the Commission will evaluate institutions and follow up on trouble areas, opportunities to allow complaints and comments about the institution under review, and offering institutions the opportunity to have due process on decisions that the institution believes to be made in error or prejudice related to due process. The second accreditation policy subtype is accreditation activities. Here you will see the different types of accreditation activities that the Commission offers policy guidance on. These include policy guidance for what we call applicant or candidate institutions, which are institutions seeking to enter MSCHE's membership and become accredited, as well as other general accreditation processes, including self-study evaluation, ongoing other proceedings. This last grouping includes policy related to what we call due process. That is, the Commission has policies to support an institution's right to appear before the Commission, demonstrating why their accreditation should not be withdrawn, and other processes that allow the institution to appeal an adverse accreditation action. The Commission also maintains policies around ongoing monitoring, which are a critical piece of oversight for our member institutions. You will see here some ongoing monitoring activities that are outlined in the Commission's accreditation review cycle and monitoring policy and procedures. The ARCM, as it is known internally, addresses requirements for an annual institutional update, or AIU, where institutions provide the Commission with data and indicators on student enrollment, achievement, and financial indicators of viability. There are also policies that address how follow-up reports and visits will be conducted, and guidance on how to write and respond to follow-up reports. Institutions may also submit something called a teach-out plan and agreement, which is a list of institutions with similar programs that have agreed to take on an institution's students should the institution close or merge, and a plan for how students will transfer out and receive critical records such as transcripts. Finally, as part of our ongoing monitoring activities, the Commission may request out-of-cycle supplemental information reports. These are requests for additional information due to media reports or other third-party avenues of information outside of the self-study cycle. As mentioned earlier, the Commission maintains separate policies for other proceedings related to due process. We are required by federal regulation to maintain a show cause, appeals, and arbitration process for institutions. Institutions that are close to having an adverse action taken against them or having their accreditation withdrawn may appear before the Commission at one of its meetings for what is termed a show cause hearing. A show cause hearing is an opportunity for an institution to make its case to MSCHE for why its accreditation should not be withdrawn and it is supplemented by a campus visit by the Commission's liaison to the institution with the follow-up team, along with a report about the visit and the upcoming hearing. Here you will also see additional other activities for accreditation. These include complaints involving applicant and member institutions, third-party comments for institutions under review, and whistleblower complaints. These policy documents are similar to the ones just mentioned in the sense that they help provide an opportunity to raise concerns about an institution and address how the Commission will review and respond to any claims or allegations leveled against the Commission or leveled against the institution under review. Accreditation policies also have a subtype of institutional policies, where accreditation policies on accreditation activities, reviews, and proceedings are focused on the Commission's evaluation and the work of accreditation. Institutional accreditation policies govern the oversight of institutions and their processes. For example, MSCHE requires institutions to maintain their own transfer of credit, prior learning, and articulation agreements policy. We do not say what specifically institutions must have in these required policies, but we do require and evaluate the policies to ensure that institutions have one and adhere to best practices outlined in them. The Commission takes a non-prescriptive approach to these policies, and indeed, they are written broadly because we accredit a wide variety of institution types with disparate types of missions. This ensures that all of the institutions are able to meet these policies, and the specifics then are set by the institutions. Here, you can see each of MSCHE's institutional accreditation policies. Finally, MSCHE also maintains another policy subtype, which is administrative policies. These policies govern the administrative work of the Commission as an organization and its business functions. They address our own standards and processes for how we operate as an organization. Each of these policies serve an important role to the fair, professional, and impartial conduct of the Commission staff as an organization. Of particular importance are MSCHE's policies on conflicts of interest, maintenance and retention of Commission records, and the review of Commission standards, requirements of affiliation, and policy. The latter is required by federal regulation and provides key transparency around the review, revision, and development of Commission policy documents. As mentioned before, this is the review of Commission standards review of Commission standards, requirements of affiliation, and policy that we are required to maintain. And you will see here that it is required in this federal regulation. As part of our policy, it actually states and lets the public know that we are adhering with federal regulation by maintaining the policy. And it also establishes the procedures for how we will establish and maintain our own policy and procedures. In it, it requires that we have something called a call for public comment, and it also goes over the approval process. And so we will review the Commission's approval process and general principles for developing a policy review process in the next slides. MSCHE follows a systemic process for policy review and development. To ensure the policy and procedures are relevant, up to date, and adequate, the Commission will initiate a periodic review. There are different types of review. New policy allows the Commission to develop any new statements of policy that the Commission has not had before. The need for new policy may be due to changes in federal regulations, new legal issues for the Commission, gaps following holistic analysis of the Commission's policy, revisions to the Commission's requirements of affiliation or standards for accreditation, emerging issues or trends in higher education, innovative practices, major shifts in process, feedback provided during the comment period on another policy. We also have substantive revision to policies. These involve changing, adding, or removing an existing statement of policy. For both new policies and substantive revisions to accreditation policies, there will be a public call for comment, which I will review in depth further. For now, note that the policy and procedures will then be reviewed and endorsed after this public comment by the Commission or the Executive Committee on its behalf. The Commission operates on a quarterly basis for publishing policies, and so once policies are approved, the policy documents will become effective on January 1, April 1, July 1, or September 1. At that time, the policy will be considered effective and enforceable by the Commission. We also have several minor types of policy revision and review. These include technical amendments, which are corrections, reorganization, or formatting changes to a policy, but they do not involve substantive change to the statement of policy. A technical amendment may be made to policies or procedures at any time, and Commission approval is not required. A technical amendment will not have a new effective date. Similarly, an editorial change is a minor correction or typographical error, and there is no substantive change to the statement of policy. An editorial change will not change the effective date. Finally, as part of the policy review process, we do evaluate if a policy should remain in effect or if the material is adequately covered in other policies or is no longer effective or followed in practice. When a policy is no longer accurate or relevant, the Executive Committee will be asked to vote to withdraw it. A withdrawn policy will have an effective end date upon which enforcement of the policy will end, and the document will be removed from the website. The Commission does maintain its own internal policy archive, and this allows us to refer back to policies that may have been effective at an earlier date and time but have since become withdrawn. When developing a brand new policy, consider the needs of your organization and the institutions that it serves. Ask yourself, are there certain questions that are frequently posed by institutions that might require written clarification in policy? Are there broad practices in higher education that you want to address how your institution how your organization will review or consider those practices when evaluating institutions? Is there research or regulatory movement on a particular policy topic area? These questions will help inform if there should be policy developed or policy revisions made to your existing policies. The major components of MSCHE's typical policy development process is listed here. This process includes research, drafting, review by internal and external stakeholders as necessary, and approvals. At the Commission, the Policy Department meets with our internal stakeholders, which include Commission staff, and the units that are directly involved in implementing the policy. In some cases, the policy unit will reach out to peer evaluators who are trained in unique issues or have specific experience related to the policy to provide another perspective on the policy's development. Policy unit also provides drafts to the executive leadership team of MSCHE prior to review by other internal stakeholders to discuss policy implications or major decisions. MSCHE also has an internal stakeholder group that is comprised of staff from across the organization. This group is called the Policy Advisory Group, and they represent a diverse array of perspectives from across MSCHE and expertise, including IT, finances, accreditation services and organizations, and our vice presidents for institutional field relations. Having a diverse group of stakeholders on this internal group serves as a vetting mechanism for reviewing each of these policy documents and ensuring that they get looked at with a wide variety of perspectives. I will talk briefly now about a public review process that is called a public call for comment. As mentioned earlier, the Commission is required to maintain this process by federal regulation. And so for accreditation policies, the Commission will issue this public call for comment. This is an opportunity to participate in the policy development process by reviewing the policy changes, considering the implications of the policy, and providing feedback. The Commission will post a notification on its website and send out an email alert to institutions, letting them know that a new proposed policy has been posted to the website, and institutions are welcome to submit their feedback for consideration and revision to the policy. When the Commission issues this call for comment, the CEO and ALO of the institution will receive an email from the Commission. In most cases, the documents for review will be linked in the survey or provided as an attachment, and again, they are also posted on the public website. The goal of a public call for comment is to seek widespread feedback on content and determine where clarifications to the proposed policy may be needed. We accept all feedback on content. Although we must adhere to federal regulations, we are not able to change every single provision that addresses regulatory requirements. Finally, we use the policy call or the public call for comment process to understand any implications for the policy on institutions that have not previously been considered. We do not limit or otherwise restrict how many submissions we receive per institution. The more feedback and insight that we get from the public, the better. We encourage public comment. The documents are posted on the website under the Policies Under Review tab and include information about the revision, including the type of review and description of the key aspects of the revision or new proposed policy, such as the type of review and a description of the key aspects of the revision. There is also a link on the website to submit feedback online. As noted earlier, once policies have been approved after the public call for comment period has concluded, the Commission staff communicates those changes through its newsletters and posting on the website. The Commission also sends emails to notify the ALO and CEO of policy changes. I will talk a little bit further about the policy approval process and later policy implementation next. Here you will see the major components of the Commission's typical policy process for developing policy. This includes the research. That may include looking at what other accreditors are doing or other organizations that model some of the work that your organization is doing. It also includes what institutions are doing and best practices in the field of higher education. As part of the research, then, that research is focused and folded into the actual drafting of different versions of the document, and those drafts are presented to different stakeholders for their review, their input, and further revisions. Then, as previously mentioned, we do a call for comments in the accreditation process. And that will take place, we usually give it about a month, and we will continue to seek feedback and incorporate that feedback into revisions of the policy. After feedback has been reconciled at each stage of the process, policies must go through approvals. At the Commission, we do have several groups that approve our process or approve our policies at different stages, and I will talk about those in just a moment. Finally, in order for a policy to become effective, we must also consider the implementation of the policy. And I will talk again about that in a moment. So, at the Commission and how MSCHE approaches its policy framework is that different types of policies and procedures require different types of approval. This is both a method that is designed to engage the public and also ensure efficiency in the policy development process. So you can see here the two different types of approval processes depending on what type of policy document is being developed. For accreditation policies, you will notice that the policy review process is much more substantive. Accreditation policies directly impact the work of accreditation and how institutions operate, and therefore they do have some more stringent requirements associated with them. You will see that each of the policy reviews start with executive leadership review from the initial draft. That initial draft is based on research, and then it goes to the executive leadership team. After executive leadership team's review and their feedback is incorporated, the policy will go to an internal stakeholder group review. At MSCHE, we have this group called the Policy Advisory Group, which consists of folks from across the organization. Um, and the folks in the organization provide a variety of perspectives. As I mentioned before, it's comprised of folks from information technology, finance, institutional vice presidents for institutional field relations, and folks from other areas as well, in order to ensure that their perspectives and expertise are reflected and incorporated into the policy. Accreditation policies also go through the public call for comment process, as I mentioned earlier. Um, After the public call for comment process concludes, the commission does summarize the comments that it receives and also takes note of the recurring inquiries that we receive in order to strengthen the policy. So if there are recurring comments that come up through the policy, through the public comment process, the commission will take that feedback into consideration and determine if there should be clarification made within the policy or if there should be other supplemental training or documents released in order to ensure understanding and compliance with the policy. Once the document has gone through the public call for comment process and has been revised, then the policy will return back to internal stakeholder review at the commission. And that group that will review it next is called the President's Cabinet. The President's Cabinet is a group of folks from across the organization. They are all leaders in the organization. They all lead or oversee units. And so they, again, provide a diverse array of perspectives. Their review is critical. It is discussed at a cabinet meeting and then approved. Once the policy becomes approved, it also will go through another round of executive leadership review and approval before finally going before the executive committee of the commission and full commission approval. You will notice that the administrative policy and procedures, accreditation procedures, and guidelines all have a similarly stringent process for review, but it does leave out two components of the review process that accreditation policy does have. So administrative policy and procedures, accreditation procedures, and guidelines do include executive leadership review and the internal stakeholder group review. They are not required to have a public call for comment. We revise our policy, or our procedures quite frequently. And every time we do a public call for comment, it is a very time-consuming process. So allowing procedures to not require public call for comment allows us to move efficiently and nimbly and be responsive to any changes that may occur that require a policy revision. These types of policy documents will still require an internal stakeholder group endorsement with our President's Cabinet, and they are still reviewed by executive leadership. Depending on the type of policy document, we may also require finance or executive committee approval, not full commission approval. The Finance Committee will review and approve any finance-related documents. For example, we do have a dues and fees procedures, which outline our dues and fees that institutions are required to pay in order to keep their membership in good standing. And so as part of that review, they are administrative procedures, but the Finance Committee is required to approve them each year. So this is a visualization of the policy approvals process and the different groups. You can see that it's ushered along by groups who are involved at various stages of the process. They're largely the same across policy documents, but as I mentioned previously, periodically, depending on the type of policy document, accreditation policies will have a more rigorous review, and that is because it includes the call for public comments. So to start, you see that an internal policy or a policy is developed, and that includes the research and the drafting. Then it will go to review by executive leadership, where major policy changes will be discussed and implications will be discussed. The executive leadership team's feedback will be incorporated into the draft, and then the draft of the policy will be reviewed by this internal stakeholder group, which we call our policy advisory group. And then depending on the type of policy that it is, if it is an accreditation policy, it will go for a call for public comment. If it is not an accreditation policy, it will go to review by the President's Cabinet. After review by the President's Cabinet, the policy will be approved once more by the executive leadership team before going to the Commission's committee, if required, or having full commission approval. The final piece of a sound policy framework is implementation of the policy that has been developed. Policies do not become effective without a plan to address how they will be implemented. In order to ensure a policy can become effective and the organization is prepared to enact the policy, consider developing the following elements. A project plan is critical to outlining what pieces of the policy need support. Is there a piece of the policy that must be updated or a form that should be developed to address monitoring or reporting requirements? Who will have the responsibility to oversee that the policy is being implemented properly? What milestones are there and how will compliance with the policies be documented? There may also be budget implications to adopting a policy, particularly if it calls for technological infrastructure or support. This can include updates made to the organization's website or hiring additional staff to support an initiative. It's important to consider what the budget implications may be and if the policy needs to have a different effective date based on the financial plan for the organization and when the policy is slated to become effective. A schedule is also a key part of the project plan for policy implementations to ensure that there are milestones developed broken into achievable tasks. At MSCHE, we use a platform called Salesforce to manage our reviews of an institution. Because of this, we always consider if revisions to an existing policy or a new policy will require any changes to be made to this platform. Strong policy implementation should also include a communication strategy. How will you communicate that there is a new policy? What do institutions need to know? Similarly, training is also critical for staff and institutions. Consider if the material in the policy should be covered in a webinar training for institutions, or if it should be covered in other materials, such as a communications campaign on social media or a one-pager with information. You should also think about training for internal staff. Consider if training for staff will help them to understand and adhere to the policy or have the understanding of how to guide and advise institutions. Finally, when thinking through policy implementation, MSCHE uses templates and forms to document much of the work of accreditation. Many of our accreditation policies have associated templates and forms. Because of this, when revisions are made to policy, templates and forms must be checked and updated or developed to ensure that the policy can be implemented effectively. All right, that was a lot of information in a condensed period of time, and I do see that we have some questions, so I want to turn my attention to those, but I also encourage you to leave other questions as they may come up. So we have a question about what tools or templates are recommended for maintaining version control, tracking policy updates, and ensuring institutional memory. At MSCHE, we use a platform called Box, and Box allows us to develop documents internally and also have them available publicly. In Box, you are actually able to see different versions of the document. But what we found most effective for doing different versions of the document and ushering them through the review process is actually saving different copies. So when we have documents that are developed for ELT, for the executive leadership team, we save a version that's called draft for ELT. When we make those changes and we begin to usher that document through the next phase to our internal policy advisory group, we save a new version and say draft for policy advisory group. When we save the different versions with the names of the groups and the dates that they're presented to them, it allows us to have a record of what's going on in the policy review process and also to see the changes between versions. And sometimes that is helpful because there may be changes that are made for a policy for 1 year that we need to get rid of or go back to for another year. So I think it's helpful to have the different versions of the documents saved with the date and the group that is reviewing the policy on them. And we do all of our work for this in Box, but of course you can use any kind of software document management program. We also have a question about what evidence or documentation is most critical to demonstrate policy implementation and effectiveness during our accreditation audit. So I think what's most important to demonstrate policy implementation um, is really to have a project plan written down. So when I talked about implementation in the last slide, and I'll go back to it, um, this project plan is absolutely critical, and the project plan should address each of these elements that are also listed on the screen. So it should include the milestones, the schedule for when things will happen, if there are any information or technological pieces that should be implemented, and it should also address the communication strategy, training, and then if there's like supplemental documentation that should be developed. Um, we also have a question about the role of internal stakeholders, such as academic staff, administration, and students in the policy development and review process. At MSCHE, we use internal stakeholders to refer to commission staff and commissioners, and we would consider institutions and students to be external stakeholders. So they play a really important role in the public call for comment process when we post policies to our website and email folks to let them know that there is a public comment that is ongoing and invite their feedback. That's invaluable because, as I mentioned before, oftentimes they will ask for clarification or present other perspectives that we had not previously considered and that we will want to address in the policy before it becomes finalized. Um, I did just want to check and make sure I got all of that. Sorry. And then for internal stakeholders, like commission staff, their role is in a couple of different places. We have a group, an internal stakeholder group called the Policy Advisory Group, and we also have an internal stakeholder group called President's Cabinet. Both of these groups are comprised of folks from across the organization that don't have policy backgrounds. Their expertise is in other areas such as finance, information technology, communications, the vice presidents for institutional field relations who do a lot of the work with the institutions on accreditation. And so having their perspectives is essential when reviewing the policies because they can always consider if something should be clarified or if someone from with their background might have a question on something. Um, and similarly, I see a question about someone asking what is meant by president's cabinet and who its members are. The president's cabinet is a separate internal stakeholder group. Um, it is again comprised of folks from across the organization. So not just policy people, not just people on executive leadership, but it really is everybody who is a supervisor or at the top of their department. Um, so for example, at the commission, we have the director of membership, we have the director for human resources, we have the senior director for information technology, we have our chief financial officer, we have our senior director for policy. These are all folks that are from across the organization and who are heads of their individual units. Um, I see a question here about who will be the reviewer of policy development after research or drafting. Is it internal or external? So I'm not sure if this is talking about a policy framework or the actual policy document, but at MSCHE, we have a specific policy department, and they're the ones who kind of guide the review process and manage it. Um, but we also are trying to switch to a model where we have our experts inform more of our policy revisions. So, for example, our vice presidents for institutional field relations who work so closely with institutions hear a lot of the questions that they get on the ground about accreditation. And so they might have a particular expertise or knowledge about what pieces of a policy should be clarified. And so we welcome their input. But the actual coordination of revising the documents and getting them out to the next phase of the review process is done by our policy department. And that is all done internally. I see a question about what is the most effective institutional approach for publishing policies to ensure their actual implementation and adherence across the university? So this is a question I think about compliance. Um, and I think that there's a couple pieces to this. One is to make sure that institutions understand what the policy is, and that can be handled by having the clear and articulate policy documents themselves. But it also should include a training and communication strategy. So communications would be letting institutions know that there is a new policy and what is contained in the policy. For policies that are revised that may have had previous editions that have since been updated, um, I think it's very important to make sure that they understand what changes have been made and how that impacts their work. Um, And sorry, I'm just trying to scroll down to it. The other piece to this too is the training piece, which is to make sure that institutions are trained in the policy itself. So we have done that frequently through webinars. We've also had brought in external speakers to do our webinars to kind of give more expert insight on the different policy areas. But I think that those approaches, a strong training and communications plan, as well as adhering to a strong project plan, would be the most effective approach to ensuring implementation and adherence. And similar to that, we do also maintain this document on our website called Evidence Expectations by Standard Guidelines. It's a mouthful of a title, but it is essentially all of the pieces of documentation that an institution can submit in order to demonstrate that they are complying with the Commission's policies, procedures, and standards for accreditation. Do you conduct any auditing on the implementation of policies? That is all. So there's two answers to this. One is that we have our institutional policies that we expect institutions to maintain. That is checked during the accreditation review cycle. So during self-study, we will ask them for the policies that we require them to have, and we will ask them to demonstrate compliance and document that they're complying with the own policies that they set. Are there specific timeframes for updating policies, and can institutions update them whenever necessary? So for institutions are just required to have policies as soon as the policy becomes effective. So if a policy that we set as the accreditor becomes effective on January 1, after January 1, the institution should be developing the policies and getting that forward. Could you please provide more clarification on the policies withdrawal? Sure. So it's not super frequently, but periodically we do have policies that become outdated for whatever reason. Either the information that's included to them is better addressed in another existing policy, or the information that's included to them is wholly outdated because a regulation has changed or a practice in higher education has changed and nobody does that thing that the policy covered anymore. So when that happens, we do withdraw the policy, and we do have that withdrawal policy approved by our commission. After the commission withdraws after the commission votes to approve the withdrawal of the policy is marked as withdrawn, and an effective end date is added to our system, upon which the policy will then be taken down after that end date from our website, and then we do maintain it in an internal policy archive. And that's to keep our own records straight, so that if an institution asks about a policy that was in place at a particular time, we have a record that this policy was effective at this time, but it is not effective in our current day. Lots of great questions coming in. How do we know if our institution meets the recognized accreditation policy? There should be you should work with your accreditor to make sure that you're meeting their expectations, and making sure that your policy is compliant with whatever policy is set out by the accreditor. So there have been quite a few questions, and I know I've been going at a rapid pace. I was a little bit worried we wouldn't make it through all of the slides. But we did, and we had time to spare, and we had time for questions. So, we have a question about how you handle.
Thank you very much, Bridget. Yeah. Please go ahead.
Oh, sure. We have a question about how do you handle documents control? I'm assuming this is about like the management of documents, and getting them through the review process. I mentioned earlier that we actually create different versions of the documents for each stakeholder, and that's to have a record of what's presented to each stakeholder at which point in time. So we just save different versions, and then once the final version is approved, we make a note that it is the final effective version. We also use track changes during the review process, and so that allows us to see suggestions made to take out a word or to add this word or this piece of language. They show up in red in Microsoft Word, and it's very helpful. But when a policy becomes effective, we accept those changes, and save a new version as the effective version. You will also notice on the commission's website, if you were to scroll down on one of our policy documents, there's a footer there. And that footer contains information about what policy it is, when it was approved and who it was approved by, the related policy documents, and also any federal regulations that may apply. We have a question about how can we make sure that the different departments through the institution who are responsible for implementing policies do so? This is a great question, and it's one that I sometimes struggle with because it's really hard to get folks to uh, make sure that they're staying on top of what they're assigned to. I think what's really important is again to have that project plan that clearly articulates whose responsibility is what and when. When you have a clear delineation between what each responsibility is and when it is due, you create more of an impetus for people to adhere to it because it's written down and it's documented and they know that I am responsible for this piece. So I think a strong project plan that outlines what the pieces of the project are, who is responsible for what, and when the expectation is that the implementation piece is completed by is really important. All right. I think we are slowing down on questions. I'm happy to answer some more if you have them. And if you don't, that's okay too.
I believe there are no more questions from the audience. Thank you very much, Bridget, for today. I think I just invite our attendees to come back tomorrow. We have 3 other sessions. Continue. We're starting with strategic planning for the university and stuff, and we're starting at 4 o'clock. Thank you very much for today. See you all
Excellent.
tomorrow.
Thank you all for your time.